Steve, why don't you've got charts on this? Set the scene for us on just how big the national debt problem is at this point.
Yeah, Mika, before we delve into the details of the House package, let's just remind ourselves and everybody just how bad this problem already is before we get to anything else that might happen. So here's the federal budget deficit going back to 2018, and you can see we were down here in the 500 billion to trillion range, and then COVID hits, fine, the deficit jumps up. We would all expect that, and that's what government's here for. It did drop down again, but now it is on this relentless rise, and these are projections, the green bars, going all the way out here to over $2.5 trillion of deficits a year. This is not how it is supposed to work. When things are relatively good and the economy is growing, we should be having a lower deficit and saving our firepower to use when we have a problem. That's not what's happening here at the moment, even before you get to any of the president's new proposals. That, of course, has led to a lot more debt. We now have over $30 trillion of debt. For the first time in our history, except World War II, we will have debt that's equal to 100% the size of our economy. It's gone up under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, but the scorecard over the last 40 years, out of curiosity, is $14 or so trillion added under Republican presidents, about $12.5 trillion under Democratic presidents. So there are not clean hands on either side. And then given the size of those deficits, not surprisingly, the debt will continue to rise sharply and well exceed the rate of growth of our economy.
Okay, so if you could explain to us how the GOP plan would work, take us through the numbers.
So what the House approved yesterday is what, as you said, Trump likes to call one big, beautiful bill. It encompasses all of the things they're trying to get done. There are some various complicated parliamentary reasons why it actually needs to be in one big, beautiful bill, but whatever. So the signature piece of it, of course, are tax cuts, and I'll talk a bit more about those later, but up to $4.5 trillion of tax cuts over the next 10 years. And then spending increases, a few spending increases for their priorities. Judiciary and Homeland are both basically border-oriented spending. And then defense, which both parties, to a considerable degree, needs to have spent more on them. So roughly $300 billion more spending. But then they're talking about cutting a lot of spending. And so the Energy Commerce Committee is tasked with cutting $880 billion worth of spending. It's expected that that could be heavily out of Medicaid, could represent about 10% of our Medicaid spending. And so they're very focused on spending on Medicaid. But there's another guy who's not so focused on Medicaid. Take a listen.
Look, Social Security won't be touched, other than if there's fraud or something. We're going to find it's going to be strengthened, but won't be touched. Medicare, Medicaid, none of that stuff is going to be touched.
Nothing.
You don't have to. Now, if there are illegal migrants in the system, we're going to get them out of the system and all of that fraud, but it's not going to be touched. We're going to love and cherish Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We're not going to do anything with that other than if we can find some abuse or waste, we'll do something, but the people won't be affected. It'll only be more effective and better.
So this wasn't a campaign promise. This is stuff he said since he's been president, contradicting what the House is doing. So it's going to be a very interesting process on Medicaid, which is obviously a very sensitive subject. And by the way, programs like Medicaid, like food stamps that he's talking about cutting as much as 20%, the House talking about cutting as much as 20% of, red states actually get a disproportionate amount of this money. So it's going to be interesting to see how Congress people hear what they hear in their districts and what they say. Student loans, another big target, could cut about 10% out of student loans. And then there's another $500 billion of unspecified spending. 62 of it would be what's called oversight. Those are federal pensions. So he's talking about cutting, they're talking about cutting $50 billion out of federal pensions. But when you add all this up, the administration, which says it's going to reduce the deficit, actually has a plan to increase the deficit by $2.8 trillion over the next 10 years. And so if you look here, this is the same chart we just looked at. You add in these new deficit increases, and you can see that instead of even dropping for a couple of years, it doesn't drop at all, and it just goes up further and further.
So lastly, Steve, you're going to show us how the GOP tax cuts favor the rich.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff in the tax part of this, and basically what they want to do. The central part of it is extending the tax cuts that were voted in 2017 that would expire at the end of this year. It was another bit of budget gimmickry. Would expire at the end of this year absent a renewal. But those tax cuts are what we call highly regressive, meaning they favor the wealthy substantially over the less wealthy. So people in the lowest 20% of the economy would get a 0.6% increase in their after-tax wages under this plan, and people all the way up through the 80% below the top would get still 1.4% or less. When you get up here, the top 20%, the top 1%, you see the percent increase they get in their after-tax income. Let's turn that into dollars. If you're down here, you're going to get $1,000. You might get $1,900 if you're close to the top. The top quartile gets $9,000. The top 1% gets an average of $70,000. So these are, again, what we call highly regressive tax cuts. Generally, we like to see them favor people at the bottom, not at the top. These are the opposite. The other challenge they're going to have, which is going to be a little bit fun if the stakes weren't so high, a little bit fun to watch, is that they've got this $4.5 trillion for tax cuts in this budget plan, as I said. Almost all of that will be consumed by extending these individual tax cuts that would otherwise expire. But during the campaign, the president ran around promising all kinds of other tax cuts. No tax on Social Security income. Restore the full deduction on state and local taxes. No tax on overtime. No tax on tips. Deduct in your taxes the cost of your auto loan. So he made all these promises. The whole thing adds up to about $7.8 trillion. So they're going to have to fit $7.8 trillion of promises into a box that's $4.5 trillion in size. And that's going to be an interesting push-pull between the administration and the Congress as well.
Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner with his charts and sound bites. Thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate it.